First thing is question everything you believe. I start every September, I'm in the process right now of writing things down, things that challenges my beliefs. Why? Because I believe if you stay with the status quo, you're not living a proper life. You're not living a decentralized life. You need to question everything, and especially even the people around you. In fact, don't give anybody around you a pass. Always treat them like an M&M conference. And I think after listening to this podcast, you'll probably understand why I say that. And I think, you and I are both laughing, because that's kind of how you and I have actually always had this relationship, and why I think you feel good about it, because you know that I'm not coming to rip your heart out. I'm doing this because I care.
Welcome to the Smarter Not Harder podcast. This is Dr. Achacoso, your host for this episode. Occasionally, we delve into the groundbreaking and often controversial ideas shaping the future of healthcare and medicine. Today, we have a guest who is nothing short of a medical maverick, a man who challenges the status quo and isn't afraid to speak his mind, Dr. Jack Kruse. Dr. Kruse is a practicing neurosurgeon, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. He is a thought leader who has ventured into the realms of quantum biology, decentralized medicine, and even the financial world of Bitcoin, all in the pursuit of a more holistic understanding of health and wellness. Known for his paradigm-shifting concept of decentralized medicine, Dr. Kruse advocates for a healthcare system that empowers the individual, a system that he believes is more in tune with the laws of nature and physics. He challenges us to think about health sovereignty and the role of trustless systems in the future of medicine. From his personal transformation following a torn meniscus in 2007, Dr. Kruse embarked on a journey that led him to explore the interconnectedness of light, magnetism, and electricity with human health. This awakening has had a profound impact on his subsequent work, including his approach to neurosurgery and his educational endeavors. He's an author, a public speaker, and a social media personality who doesn't shy away from controversy. Whether it's critiquing the addictive nature of social media or questioning the limitations of modern medicine, Dr. Kruse is a man who provokes thought and invites debate. Today, he answers three main $64,000 questions for us. Number one is, what is decentralized medicine and what is its impact on society and healthcare? Second, are we really creatures of light? How might a new photobiology change in medicine and lifestyle practices affect us? And third, are we really in a verge of an extinction event because of our chronobiology being interfered on by all the artificial light that we have created? So buckle up, listeners, because today's episode promises to be a roller coaster ride to the mind of one of the most intriguing and controversial figures in modern healthcare. Without further ado, this is Jack Kruse. Hello there, I'm Dr. Achacoso, and today I have Dr. Jack Kruse. He is temporally a longtime friend, but not a chronologically longtime friend. So his epigenetic age is way younger than mine, so if you take it. But Jacques is one of the most brilliant people in the world that you'll ever meet, but brilliant not only in the theoretical sense, but in a practical sense. His ideas have influenced me for the long time that we've been friends, and I've been lucky to be in his good side because he will actually berate me if I got things wrong. And that's what I love about him, is that he actually berates me, but he still loves me. So that's pretty cool, right? To have someone actually guide you like that. So Jack is also my favorite futurist. Aside from looking at development in physics, etc., and apply it in a practical way to health, he actually sees in the future, especially the future of healthcare. So the first question I actually like to ask Jack is, Jack, what's the next best thing in healthcare that you think everyone should be prepared for?
It's a loaded question, but a good one. I think that the next big step is going to be decentralized medicine. And, we have to kind of, I guess, define that. because there's a lot of different facets to this.
Yes.
You and I are both MDs, so we both trained allopathic. I would say, knowing your path the last 10 years, you've probably done more functional than allopathic. I look at decentralized being the next step that's even above that. The reason I believe decentralization is going to happen is for two things. The globalists are getting taken apart, not only politically, economically, and socially, but also it's happening even in medicine. And I think COVID is a big part of that. But I think the main issue that's driving decentralization, because of what we all lived through in COVID, is actually the fight for freedom. Medical freedom, informed consent, that is a huge part of decentralization. It's not a huge part of allopathic medicine, and it's certainly not a huge part of functional medicine. It's almost like this aspect is almost unique to decentralized medicine, because you and I both know that we have informed consent, for different things. Like if you were coming to see me for a subdural hematoma, you would sign your consent form, and that's informed consent. But that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about some of the more nefarious things that have gone on in healthcare the last 10 or 15 years, where, you can have a baby inside the hospital and they're given that baby injections and vitamin K and things like that. And this is because they say it's part of our policy. We don't have to ask your opinion about it. I have huge problems with that, because I believe fundamentally that patients should know everything that's happening to them, and sit down with their doctor before it happens, have a discussion about the pros, the cons, the positives, the negatives, even things that aren't positive and negative, like things that you should think about, based on your life, and I'll give you an example. Just the last time you and I were physically together, when we were in Ballast Island, and the discussion that you and I had about the Filipino women that were walking around with umbrellas and doing injections of glutathione in their face. To me, I don't think the people that were doing the injections in the face were really giving informed consent totally. They were fulfilling a need of those women who was really wants, needs, and desires, but I don't think they got into the hardcore issue about what does this really mean to remove melanin from your skin. And part of the reason for that, Ted, and I think you know this, is that the allopathic and functional paradigm doesn't really know what the unintended consequences are of that decision.
Yeah, that's melanin is a screen, right? It's
not what a lot more.
That absorbs light across all frequencies, right?
Right. And that's a big deal. And to make a decision like that, I think that not only does the patient need to be informed, but the doctor has to have the educational background to know really what the issue with that is. And in my belief structure, I was stunned at some of the things that happened the last 3 years in centralized medicine. These are things that I never would have thought happened in my life. And yet I saw them happening not only to my colleagues, I saw them happen to me. I saw them happen to my nurses. I saw them happen to my patients. And when I really saw where the fundamental problem was really at an issue where healthcare and state needs to have separation. Like in the United States, through our Constitution, we have separation of church and state. That's part of the pillars of why the United States Constitution was written as it was. But the gentleman who brought this up to the founding fathers was Benjamin Rush. And Rush Medical School is named after him in Chicago.
Right.
But I find that the most disappointing part of that story is that nobody actually who's an American doctor or even a doctor anywhere in the world truly knows what Benjamin Rush's contribution was to medicine back then in the 1760s and 70s. And they certainly don't know that the things that he told John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were probably the most important things why I think decentralized medicine is going to be the future of medicine. Because I think since 1982, when Fauci was nominated by Reagan, we have been on a path, and it's not just a path because of Fauci. It's a path because of the laws that were passed. Like the big law that predated Fauci that really set centralized medicine aflame, as far as I'm concerned, was the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, where it basically allowed taxpayer-funded research for researchers who work for the government or work for an institution to benefit from their research. And I just thought to myself, even back then, I said, the unintended consequences of that decision, I think, are going to be a problem, because I'm all for someone benefiting from their research, in terms of the PhD researchers or the MD PhDs doing it. But Ted, the real unintended consequence that we saw, the first one was in 1986 when Reagan followed up and made the vaccine law, where he gave liability to the big pharma. And that was a consequence of the 1980 Dole-Bayh Act. And when you think, about that famous saying that you always hear from Charlie Munger, that incentives dictate outcomes. Well, the incentive after the Vaccine Act of 86 was that legal liability meant big pharma would then start a track where they would focus on how could they maximize vaccine profits, since they face no liability, which through especially your work with big pharma, that's a huge problem on the drug development side.
Yeah.
So when that happened, and then you see the current events that have happened in centralized and functional medicine, say since 1986 to today, and it's really been magnified the last 3 years, I think all of us, no matter what our political ideology are, we know that there's a big problem. And I guess the sad part for me is I don't think a lot of people in our profession, and I don't think the press, I don't think politicians, I don't think they've done a proper morbidity and mortality conference about this issue to realize where we really went off the tracks. And it began with that act in 1980.
It was a bifurcation point, right?
Correct.
Where the whole thing took place. So, but Jack, explain to me, what is the what is the gist of the paradigm of decentralized medicine? Because it seems to be a fundamental shift, right? And,
it's proof of work.
I think our audience needs to understand what's that fundamental shift that is going to occur, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I would tell you this one is simple. It's proof of work, but I have to explain, if you had an audience full of doctors who own Bitcoin, they would know what this meant. But I know I don't. For scientists that will listen to this, clinicians that will listen to this, I can easily make this understandable. Proof of work in nature is exactly how all nature works. All of nature's networks are decentralized. That means there's no central controller. So, for example, in biology, it's light and dark comes together. That creates the circadian couple. And to make it even more simple is take a look behind me. You see the trees behind me. They participate in photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is proof of work. You take light and you marry it up with CO2 and water and you create sugar. And as the guy who is a fellow mitochondriac like I am, that mitochondria reverse the process of photosynthesis. Yes. So when you understand that photosynthesis is one of the key basic decentralized networks in nature based around chlorophyll and the rubisco enzyme, and the organelle that you and I like to talk about the most and we specialize in reverses that process, then you begin to understand, okay, now I understand what Jack means by proof of work, because if your focus isn't on those decentralized networks, you get off the path. And you and I are birds of a feather on this topic of mitochondria. Why? Because I think where centralized medicine and functional medicine really went off the tracks is 99% of NIH funding goes to DNA and RNA. 1% goes to mitochondrial DNA. And since you and I focus in on that, and guys like Doug Wallace are probably the PhD researchers that are out there that have been toiling for 50 years in this field with a difficulty getting funded to do the things they want to do, the reason why proof of work has not really taken foothold in centralized or allopathic medicine is predominantly because of the methodology and the measures and the way we pay for studies. And that in large part is the big issue, and why decentralized medicine, I think, is going to be the next step, because I think people are beginning to realize now, especially with long COVID and the fact that the messenger RNA vaccine at its fundamental core is a mitochondrial toxin. And the result is production of the spike protein, which is a consequence of that mitochondrial toxin. People now are going to have answers that are decentralized to deal with this. In other words, there's not going to be a pill created by Big Pharma to offset the consequences of what just happened with COVID. Now, they will try to sell us on that idea, but it's incumbent upon us as the clinicians who reject centralization, who reject functional medicine, and say, how do we improve mitochondrial redox through the proof of work mechanism so that our patients can stay healthy? So that is the 80,000 foot framework that I want you to see my perspective through in the rest of, this interview.
Sure. So Jack, where does health sovereignty come in here? You and I, we had long discussions about this. I have always, starting from the late 80s, been a proponent of the patient owning its own data, and not the hospitals and so on. It's the reason. Is a reason why I started health optimization medicine, because it's health optimization, detection and correction of imbalances rather than diagnosing and treating of disease, right? It's a moving away from disease and a recognition of that the disease doesn't suddenly happen unless it's, an acute infection or trauma. Then, there's a spectrum that you go through from being healthy, just well, to actually diseased. Now, where does health sovereignty and what does it mean? Really, if you can explain it to our audience, where does it figure into the model of decentralized medicine?
It's cornerstone. It's a cornerstone part of the paradigm. And if people do not have medical sovereignty, medical freedom, not only for their data, for their decisions, they technically are subject to centralization. And that's exactly what the problem has developed, since 1980. That's part of the reason why I try to give you a very brief history of where we came from. And the problem is people don't even realize just the fact that we have electronic health records now is a problem for medical freedom. Why? Because your data is being sold to corporations, and they are coming up with algorithms that then they apply to you. This is absolutely needs to stop. And the only way for a patient to stop this currently right now, because the trend from politicians is exactly the opposite way, is actually to opt out of the system. And that's
actually, Jack, I'm guilty of in developing the electronic medical record, right? Because I was right there when the electronic medical record was being developed. And the sad truth was that I knew at the time that we were developing an electronic medical record, so we would be able to correlate it to actually correlate it with the ICD-9 before, right? It was still ICD-9 was being developed, so that you can be billed, right? And so it was for me it was like a very, very I know it's a jaded view, but even when we were developing it, so this whole thing is actually just for payment, right? For insurance, for payment, etc. It does not really adequately capture what's supposed to be captured.
I would say it's even more nefarious than that, Ted. I think you just put a great spin on it, but to me, that's the spin that puts the ketchup and mustard and the mayonnaise on the hamburger. I'm going to push that all off and take a shit right on the hamburger and tell you that it's more nefarious. They're using it to actually harm the public health. And the thing that people don't understand is, and this is, again, an 80,000 foot big idea thing for you to consider. Every time we've employed technology everywhere, because I know you enjoy technology, you know that I am always the guy that will make you think twice about liking technology, because I'll point things out to you that you might not have thought about. So the number one problem with technology, if you look at,
Jack will advise you to run nude in the sunlight.
Well, that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I'm doing a podcast.
It's a very
sunlight.
It's a very freeing proposition, by the way, guys. So
the big issue that you need to understand is when Microsoft, Google, and Meta use technology in their systems, it always has helped them in terms of efficiency. The interesting thing in medicine is, since we've employed technology in medicine, medicine hasn't become more efficient, it's become less efficient. And we can see that in data in a couple of places. The first place is doctors are killing themselves more. Doctors are also burning out faster. Why? Because we're putting them in front of blue light screens all the time. But here's the biggest one. Forget about the doctor side of things. The return on equity, if you look at what we spend on healthcare technology since 1986, the United States specifically, I'm not going to talk about other countries specifically, the United States health metrics, the return on equity for health is horrendous. We are more unhealthy today than we've ever been. And this trend didn't just start a couple of years ago. This trend has started since we brought technology in to the clinics, to the operatories, and even to surgery. And I have made the comment in my own specialty, you know, as a former neuroradiologist, I'm a neurosurgeon. One of the things that I've pointed out for 20 years to my neurosurgery colleagues is that we talk about minimally invasive spine surgery. We think because the incisions are smaller and the patients go home quicker, it's better. But then I casually point out to them, you know, to make smaller incisions and put hardware in their back, you know that we have to radiate them with x-rays. We didn't have to do that before. And I said, what do you think the effect of x-rays are on 2 or 3 hour surgery when in 1980 and 82 and 85, I only took one x-ray for the entire case, but we're using fluoro for 2 hours through the case. And the looks on their face, and this is the part that I want you to understand, Ted, they don't have that as part of the algorithm that they've used. So remember that the medical device manufacturers are as guilty as the big pharma guys, because these questions are buried from the curriculum of people that we're training today. And I'm that guy. You know me. I like to stir the pot to get people to think that just because they've come in with a pretty young lady or a pretty young man to sell you Medtronic's new pedicle screw system, you need to start to ask better questions for your patient. Not for you, not for them, for the patient. Think about them laying at the table.
I remember, Jack, I think, you know, based on what you said, like you have to take a look at, like, you never really, as an interventional neuroradiologist, you know, the thing that during my training that was emphasized to me, and I was lucky that way, is like, hey, Ted, you're sclerosing an AV mal, right? Minimize your fluoro. You know, you essentially, you just take as much as you need and nothing more. But the younger ones, man, the way they use fluoro is just incredible.
Well, right? you know, guys, when you and I both trained, you know, because this is an area in neurosurgery and neuroradiology that's changed tremendously. We don't even clip aneurysms anymore. Everything is sent to the endovascular guys first. People don't realize we're radiating their head constantly to do that. When we clipped aneurysms, we never did x-rays. The only time we did an x-ray was maybe after the case was over, where we'd stick a needle in the carotid, put some dye in there to make sure the neck was clipped. But some of us didn't even do that, because I used to argue back when I was in residency to one of my program directors. I'm like, this is stupid to take an x-ray. We got the head open. Look at it right there.
Yeah. Jack, you just reminded me of something that I've been railing about for decades now. It's not just X-ray. It's actually the use of ultrasound in pregnancy. Like, how many times do you need to ultrasound irradiate a fetus, an embryo, a fetus, and you know, in there, when you know very well that ultrasound actually causes cavitation, right? I remember, you know, my mentor, Dr. Yamamoto, and I working on, I said we had an idea before the ultrasonic toothbrushes came on. I said, let's make an ultrasonic toothbrush. So I started studying the properties of ultrasound, and I saw this cavitation going. I said, no, I'm not going to invent an ultrasonic toothbrush. But then, you know, 2 years later, ultrasonic toothbrushes actually, you know, started popping up. And I said, in pregnancy, I said, how many times do you really need an ultrasound every time you visit your obstetrician? When you're pregnant.
Well,
And
you just brought up the other point that I was trying to bring up in the neurosurgery literature. Remember that why we're doing this is CYA, it's medical malpractice for the OBGYN. Again, it's not the mother and it's not the baby who are the focus. And I would tell you the same thing is true with drug delivery. The same thing is true with vaccines. The same thing is true, Ted, if you think about every single thing that we were taught in medical school and residency and really parse it out, you will find that at least 80 to 90% of the things that we are taught, like the recipe, wasn't really well thought out for the patient. It was actually thought out for the healthcare system. And that's what the problem with centralization is all about. And you're later in your career, just like I am. And where we are now, when you actually think about how those central algorithms truly have been a problem, and that's the answer to why the return on equity for centralization has not been what anyone's expected. Why? Because the butterfly effect, the unintended consequences of the interventions that we're doing. It's the same thing, with a government. When a government thinks they can come in and make economic changes and they're better and they wind up making it worse, all you have to do is look at, Venezuela or Argentina as perfect examples of that. And we're seeing it in the United States right now. But I don't think people like to see that truth in other parts of their life. And in medicine, this is a real problem as far as I'm concerned, because when I have this discussion with patients, a lot of times they're not sophisticated enough to understand the nuances of what we're talking about. When I talk to a guy like you, I know implicitly that you know where I'm coming from, but you would be stunned how many times that I sit down and talk to nurses, to pharmacists, to physical therapists, to nutritionists, dietitians, to other doctors. These basic ideas that I throw out there, it's never come across their mindset to do it. And the reason they don't understand it, Ted, is a fundamental issue. It goes back to Rockefeller, the Flexner Report, and the obscuration of the curriculums in medical school. The thing is, people are not aware that we've had this USB upload from centralized medicine really all the way back to 1913. And they stripped out all the things that you have learned in your career to be important about mitochondrial medicine, all the way back from Albert St. Georgi, all the way up to now with biophotons and things like that. That was scrubbed from the centralized record. And, when I did the podcast with Rick Rubin and Huberman, which I know you told me you listened to, I was trying to make that case to Huberman that that's fundamentally where centralized medicine really took hold, because it destroyed the vitalist, it destroyed energy medicine, it destroyed a lot of things. It destroyed, probably naturopathic doctors, chiropractors, and many, many others that actually had, I'd even say, to be honest with you, I think it destroyed Eastern medicine, Chinese medicine. I think it affected even the Indian ideas that are in the East. I think it had a chilling effect on even the way we do research. And I think, the last 100 years, COVID was such a bad mistake by the centralized system that it's now been Windex on everybody's glass eye. So for me, medical freedom and decentralization, Ted, this is something that benefits 7 to 8 billion people on the planet. The only people that are not going to be benefited by this type of medicine are the people running centralized systems.
Yeah, we've Jack, we've had hours and hours of being together and discussing, and you have heard me lament of algorithmic medicine, right? And essentially everyone that is training right now is training in one algorithm or the other. And you just said if you don't do that, you might get sued. if you don't cover your ass here, you might get sued. And it actually has nothing to do with what's being taken care of, which is health, right? But it's something to do with the legal implications, standards of care, and so on and so forth.
But I gotta say something. I gotta interrupt you here because I want people in the audience to hear this. I've been a neurosurgeon for 30 years. Neurosurgeons on average get sued 3 times a year. I have not had any settlements against me in 30 years. So this is where I push back on the idea that CYA medicine makes sense. Why? Because I've been decentralized for 20 of the 30 years I've been a neurosurgeon, yet I still haven't been sued. So I'm going to tell you some of the critics probably that will come from centralization and functional medicine will say that if decentralization is like deregulation, it's just the Wild West, that I would expect that we may have problems, from the doctor side, meaning that we'll let all the wahoos out and start going nuts. Now, I'm going to tell you, do I have a plan for that too? Yeah, that's where medical freedom laws come in different places, like every zip code, every country. You know that the Philippines will do it different than America. America will do it different than Panama. Panama will do it different than Argentina. But ultimately, if there's a system of checks and balances in these medical freedom laws, and they're thought of quite well, I don't believe that patients are going to be harmed by these systems. In fact, the way I see the future is probably radically different than most people listening to this. I actually want decentralized medicine to go mano a mano with functional medicine and centralized medicine in the same paradigm. And I believe that over 25 years of comparing apples to apples and apples, we will be able to see when doctors judge the outcomes of their patients, meaning when the state is removed and doctors judge other doctors on their beliefs and their patients' outcomes, then and only then will we see who was wiser. Was it centralization of the Rockefellers that mattered? Was it the functional medicine guys who showed up as a reaction to the centralization guys? Or were the people that were dominant before Rockefeller, who were working in energy medicine, who were working with light, who were working with water? Will those people turn out to be wiser because they have better outcomes, because the key endpoint is the patient's outcome, not the procedure outcome? How did the patient do?
Yeah, you remember, I told you this story before. When I was starting, I started with pioneered health optimization medicine practice, where I set aside the diagnosis, right, and treatment, and basically just balance the metabolome inside your cell. And when I started in 2009, my referrals were always, okay, all of the allopathic physicians already have done what they could do. Maybe Dr. Ted could do something for you. And those were the kinds of referrals I was getting, right? Now that allopathic medicine is nothing, they cannot do anything for you anymore, they dump it on you. When for me, it's like, it's the other way around. You take care of your fundamental self first, and then let's see what allopathic medicine can do. But you're right there in terms of who's going to survive, right? So Jack, if you were...
But Ted, stop for a minute. Stop for a minute. I want you to think about what you just said, because the point you just made is beautiful. The reason why it's decentralized, because that's exactly how nature works. Remember, not every animal survives. That's why we have extinction events. That's the reason why woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers aren't here. And what I'm telling you is I believe the woolly mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers 25, 30, 40 years from now in a decentralized country is going to take out the bad doctors. But the problem is they have to be judged by people who understand what's going on. That's the reason why politicians and healthcare administrators need to be removed from the system. Doctors have to judge other doctors. And if the health outcomes aren't there, guess what? We are going to create better doctors post-residency than we did pre-residency. It doesn't mean that we're going to, completely throw all of our colleagues away who've been centralized through medical school or through naturopathic school or chiropractic school. We're going to judge them on their outcomes going forward. And then after a period of 2, 3, 4 decades, we will know definitively whose ideas are truly best that raise the public health. So this idea, and I want to make sure you really get this, this idea is not Jack's idea. Jack stole this idea from evolution. It's survival of the fittest, because the doctors who participate will have to be survival of the wisest. Some of the things that they do in writing, say, statin prescriptions or fluoroirradiating someone for minimally invasive spine disease or putting an artificial disc in someone, it may turn out that when your metrics are compared against somebody, say, who uses the photoelectric effect to improve the central retinal pathway and improve the leptin melanocortin pathway is better, then guess what? That's how we take out bad ideas from medicine. And we do it without the influence of the people making the devices, making the drugs, or paying for the service. That's the big issue. And the problem is, remember, those stakeholders, they have, for 50 to 70 years in centralized systems, have usurped the doctor's control. That has been the single biggest problem. If you look at healthcare expenditures, at least in Western medicine, what has grown faster than doctor salaries? Administrator salaries. Why do we need that? We don't, because it certainly hasn't improved the public health.
That's true. So Jack, you touched on a few things in there that I wanted to actually get an exposition on. Like, for example, you actually mentioned in another a podcast, via negativa, the removal of the superfluous elements at modern. What are those superfluous elements that need to get removed?
Well, we just talked about a couple of them. Like, for example, and I'm going to give you my bias now. I think many of the things that we do in neurosurgery, absolutely superfluous. For example, I think we do way too much spine surgery for degenerative conditions. And I don't want to just pick on my own profession. Let's pick up on, let's say, breast surgeons. I think the amount of mammograms that we do is ridiculous. Let's talk about the gastroenterologist. The way we screen for colon cancer, absolutely preposterous. Pediatricians and the way they use vaccines and antibiotics, psychotic. Let's talk about internal medicine. The use of statins on LDL cholesterol is probably the biggest mistake centralized medicine has ever made, but yet we still have people out there telling you you need to lower your LDL cholesterol, even though it's blatantly obvious in the literature that people that have the highest LDL cholesterol do the best and live the longest. So those are some of the big ideas, but I don't want anybody to think, because I just gave you a bunch of allopathic ones, there's plenty on the functional side. I can promise you these functional guys are not going to like Uncle Jack's program, because if you think it's wise for a patient to spend $20,000, $30,000 doing labs that lead to no good outcomes for them, if they still have their hypothyroidism or their mitochondrial function still blows, guess what? You need to pay the penalty, not the patient. They may have paid you $20,000, but guess what? You need to change your template, because what you believe needs to come under scrutiny. Why? Because it goes to the bottom issue. What is the return on equity for the money spent? If we want a good system of healthcare, we need results. And that's what proof of work really means. I'm trying to give you the full cycle so you understand where this is going, because there's many things. I can tell you, you've heard me say this multiple times, both live and in podcasts, that I believe that I hurt a lot of people from the time I was probably 20 years old to 40 years old. Why? Because I was just like the people that I'm criticizing now. When I had the wake-up call, I have been thinking for 20 years of how to fix the system. Why? because I fundamentally believe we can't fix the system when we're inside the system. I think it's like Buckminster Fuller said, instead of trying to fix the system within, why don't we just blow it up? So the idea that I've come up with is let's take the three competing ideas, centralization, decentralization, and functional medicine, and let's do a huge trial. And let's do it in, say, certain places in the world over a period of time, because you know that there's going to be critics in the Philippines, in the United States, in South America, in Africa, everywhere. But ultimately, people will look at this long-running experiment and go, boom. Now, don't think that I'm naive to believe that even a good experiment can go bad. I mean, we saw the Framingham heart study, started in 48, finished in 99. To this very day, it still pushes. Every cardiologist believes that the Framingham heart study said that LDL cholesterol kills you. And in fact, if you go back and look at what was published in the New York Times in January of 99, the 50-year data, it says exactly the opposite. But guess what? Even a good experiment can be stolen when doctors aren't in charge, okay? The media brings the propaganda to the table, and we find out who's incentivized the media, which is Big Pharma, device manufacturers, the American Heart Association. In other words, people who are not stakeholders in patients' health one-on-one. If you don't have skin in the game, you have no say in this system. That is the key.
Actually, Jack, I'm glad you mentioned that, because last year or 2 years ago, I proposed and presented that the Philippines have a Department of Health, which is allopathic medicine, and the Department of Health Optimization, which is a forerunner of your decentralized medicine, right? And now I have a better framework to steal from, because you now have a mature framework from which I can steal from. However, there's something that I actually am curious about in one of your statements before, that this is a trustless system. What do you mean by that?
In other words, the outcomes will tell you if what we're doing is correct. For example, let's try to make this blatantly simple. If you have an orange tree and it's in Florida and it's in the sun over a period of 365 days, most farmers know that it's almost a guarantee you're going to get a harvest. Now, there's going to be things that affect the harvest. What we have in the United States right now is we have a bunch of patients who are orange trees that are getting told to wear sunglasses, sunscreen, and clothes, and somehow we think that their biology is not going to be affected by that. And I guess proof of work, I'm saying, needs to be in the advice that we deliver to patients. And, you know, many doctors are going to be upset by this podcast, and I know that already, because they're going to say, well, I can't control patients' behavior. And I'm like, you'll know if the patient is not following the rules, because if they're not following the rules, if you don't think that there's going to be some, you know, punishment for them, absolutely. Like, we know if someone tells us that they've stayed away from Twinkies and Oreo cookies, but they come in and their triglyceride level is 300, we know they're full of shit. And guess what? Will you be judged on their behavior? No, because Dr. Ted, myself, and say somebody else will sit on a medical panel and say, obviously there's no face validity for this patient because we can see the health metrics. We can see the insulin levels. We can see the blood glucose. We can also see the hemoglobin A1C. So in other words, if you're not participating, in other words, I look at patients like chlorophyll, okay? I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. But if it turns out that chlorophyll doesn't have magnesium in the center of the nitride cage, they're going to get called out in the system. And guess what? They're going to pay higher premiums to come see us. Right. Why? Because functionally, they wasted our time. And Ted, what do you know as a doctor? The most valuable thing that you and I have in our clinic is time. Everybody wants a piece of our time. So when we have somebody who's truly lying to us, we should have recourse and say, look, come to me when you get serious about proof of work. Because right now you're proof of stake. You are like Ethereum or Cardano. You're a bullshit artist. And you know what? I don't have time. I can't fix you. So if you want to live this type of life you're living, I'm fine with it. Buy term life insurance, but please don't waste my time.
So Jack, say you were to advise a country on implementing, or at least putting out the framework, the policies or the laws for decentralized medicine. How would that look like? What would the components be? And how will the efficacy or effectivity be actually evaluated?
Well, that's a great question, but it's a difficult one to answer. And I think you know the reason why, because each country, we have 196 countries in the world. Each country has different constitution, different set of laws. So I can tell you that I can look at a system, and since I happen to know the American system the best, I can tell you what the problem in America is. So how would I fix it? The first thing I would do is make it so that doctors judge doctors. So I would build an idea that's fundamentally built in our Constitution of checks and balances. But how I would do the checks and balances is I would have a 3-committee series where you'd have a true Surgeon General, say another position in the cabinet. You could call it whatever you like. Maybe say a medical director. It's a bad name because it sounds like a hospital administrator, but this is a different idea. And then say you have a Ministry of Health, or as you called it in the Philippines, something else. Those 3 bodies would be the people that administer healthcare. The Surgeon General would talk directly to the executive branch. The medical director would probably be an expert in, say, infectious diseases, and they'd have to have that. The third, and that second doctor would only be elected by doctors. Not the public, just the doctors. And then say the Ministry of Health would only be elected by the public. Here's the key.
Right.
You cannot be conflicted. You can have not worked for a medical device company. You cannot have worked for Big Pharma to hold these chairs. Not only that, if you're elected by the public, your term should be the shortest. If you're elected by doctors, it should be in the middle. If you're elected by a president, your term should probably be a decade. Why? Because you need some consistency across the administration. Here's the key. At no time does the state or the public have direct ties to the system. Who will control healthcare dollars, allocations, the process of how we run medicine? In other words, medical staff bylaws will go by the wayside. There'll be a boilerplate that this 3-party system comes up with that every hospital will have to abide by, whether they like it or not. Why? Because they are out of the business of judging doctors. Doctors will be judged by doctors, both good, bad, and indifferent. That is
what will it do to hospitals, Jack?
I think hospitals will do really well, because certain hospitals and the administrators will have to make a decision. Do we want to support centralized medicine? Do we want to support functional medicine? Do we want to support decentralized? Then the wiser hospitals, like the tertiary care centers, they're probably going to do 2 out of 3. The really wise ones are going to do all 3. Why? Because they want this information too. The person that's going to be really, really interested in this is going to be the public and probably the politicians. Why? Because the politicians are going to have money taken out of their hands. In other words, you're still going to spend healthcare dollars, but you're going to turn medical freedoms over completely to the relationship between the doctor and the patient. And you will be able to judge the doctors based on the outcomes of the patients, and who will serve as judge and jury there of whether the doctor and the patient have done their job properly. A peer group of the doctors. That 3-party system will have the ability to find 12 doctors to go and judge every case that needs to come up. And Ted, you know that not every case is going to need to come up. But, you know, for example, if I'm just trying to give you an example. If, say, a government like Canada comes out and mandates a booster shot right now, and all of a sudden, a year from now, we find out that everybody who got their 4th, 5th, and 6th boosters, say, gets myocarditis, dies, and it's blatantly obvious in the aftermarket data. And the government continues to support these mandates. In this system, it could never happen because the doctors would basically tell the Canadian healthcare system, you're still going to pay for people's healthcare, but we're not following any of your rules anymore. And the reason why is because the system now is contained within itself, and it's judged by people who understand the science. In other words, you don't have to have a guy like Fauci, the CDC, or the FDA to tell you to be the central controller to make decisions for everybody downstream. In other words, this is going to be a real-time system. It's going to be like an equalizer is in Rick Rubin's sound room. If bad sounds are coming, you're going to be able to turn the knobs. Like if there's a guy in California that is ordering, I don't know, the same test on 1,243 people, and his patients are not getting any better, and we find out, okay, he owns this lab, that guy is going to have a huge problem. The flip side of that is, if a surgeon is going and doing operations that don't need to be done, like say, I don't know, you do hernia surgery and you decide instead of just doing unilateral hernia surgery that you put in mesh in both sides on people, and you do that across the board because that's your algorithm, you're going to have a problem. And what's going to come of this is patients are going to begin to realize that when they do get harmed, they're having the right people judge the system. And the penalties, believe it or not, the penalties that I would put in, the only way that doctors will be turned over to be adjudicated by the judicial system is when the doctors say that there was absolute malintent. In other words, if you leave a sponge in somebody and this was an honest mistake, you know, and it happens, and even if the patient had a horrible outcome, I would expect the family to be very upset with our group of 12 doctors because we're probably going to exonerate that general surgeon and say, we're not going to eliminate 12 years of training because of this bad mistake, but there will be a penalty imposed, and the penalty will be financial. And the way in which the penalty will be delivered would be very counterintuitive to what currently the system is with medical malpractice. I don't really want to get too much into that because I've got big time ideas about how that would happen. But I can promise you the whole goal of my system would be to make sure that doctors get penalized in the best way that will limit their behavior. And if you hit them in the pocketbook because they consistently make bad decisions, guess what? That is how the cream rises to the top.
Yeah. So, Jack, how is something like decentralized medicine funded?
The same way centralization is funded. People are still going to pay insurance. There's still going to be like what we have in United Kingdom, NHS, what we have in Canada, the Canadian system, that can all stay. What I'm saying, Ted, is you're carving out within that system a new system where medicine controls medicine. The dollars are still allocated, but the way in which medicine is, how shall we say, delivered is now under a very extreme microscope where we're taking competing ideas on a meritocracy basis and deciding as a country. Remember, I'm not trying to talk about a continent or a majority of countries. Countries that decide to fix this problem will come to realize that they will learn very, very quickly, probably within, I think, 2 decades of figuring out what is good about centralized medicine, what is good about functional medicine, what is good about decentralized medicine, what is bad about all three. And then what will happen is that policy will mature with the doctors there. In other words, cardiologists may begin to realize that, hey, putting a stent in for angina is probably not the best treatment. I mean, some people in centralization have already got that message, but not everybody has. And the same thing is true in the emergency room. The thing that I want to see stopped, I don't want everybody to get CAT scans of their head when they don't need it. And I know the reason why it's done. It's done because a centralized system requires it. We don't need to do that. And when you add this all up, Ted, then you'll begin to see that people will begin to value non-processed food, to be valued nature, to value, I'll give you another example, to go back and look at drugs, because you and I talked about this before we came on. One of the things that I think the system needs to be done, we need to teach doctors to use old drugs, not the newest drugs. There was no reason for us to go away from methylene blue. There was no reason for us to go away from vitamin C. There was no reason for us to go away from, I don't know, let me think of cholestyramine versus, Merck's drug that came out, I forget, simvastatin. But we've never been subject to this kind of thinking. And, I pointed this out, and I don't know if you even know this. I'm assuming you do. Most people don't know that one of the most controversial drugs out of COVID, which is hydroxychloroquine, is actually a derivative of methylene blue. You know what that means? The methylene blue could have been used to treat COVID very successfully. Now, methylene blue is pretty damn cheap. Now, here's the interesting part. The reason that it couldn't happen in the United States in the centralized system was because the system that was built by that law in 1980, the one in 1986, and the subsequent laws that were passed and adjudicated by guys like Fauci and Collins, was you could not have an emergency use authorization for any vaccine if another drug was found to be successful at treating that disease. And realize that that's the reason why the science, the centralized science, was used to block guys like me and you from telling people, hey, you might want to try this instead of doing this. See, that's a decision, Ted, that needs to happen in your operatory, in my operatory, with me and the patient. And you know what? The skin in the game for me and you is if we're fucking wrong, somebody's going to come after us, okay? Yeah. But the somebody that's going to come after us isn't the medical board. It isn't Fauci. It isn't fucking Biden. It isn't Congress. It isn't, the pharmacy that says we're not going to dispense this medicine you're treating. Why? They have no fucking business between me and my patient. But guess what? If I do this over a period of, say, 6 months to a year, and my patients do better, and say Dr. B's patients who got the vaccine don't, then guess what? That 12-person board that's appointed by those 3 doctors, who are all doctors, will come and adjudicate that case medically. That's exactly how it should happen.
Yeah. Well, Jack and I, for our listeners and audience out here, Jack and I were talking, and I actually told him that my company, Transcriptions, is actually the OG methylene blue company. And, he was saying that I would do something like that. I would push something like that. But so, Jack, can you walk me through, say, I am a patient, right? I am a patient. Because I'm thinking about this from a patient and a doctor perspective. So from the doctor perspective, I see that there need to be changes in medical boards and, and so on. But from a patient, so I go to you and it's decentralized medicine, say for a particular disease, choose your favorite one as an example, and walk me through how a decentralized medicine system would work.
Well, let's take the simplest one, because I think it's the easiest one for the lay public and doctors to understand. Let's think about hypertension. So hypertension is a huge problem. Most of us know the reason why it's a big issue, because it can lead to bad medical outcomes that are very, very expensive. And dealing with someone's blood pressure is simple. So instead of the first choice of coming into the office, and just for argument's sake, the first thing we have to do is define what a high and low blood pressure would be for the patient's age, and I would like to say haplotype, because in my practice, it would tie to their haplotype, their latitude. Are they mismatched? For example, I'll give you an example of this because I think you'll understand it great. If a guy from Somalia comes into my clinic in Toronto, that guy's not getting medication. Okay. Now, if it's a guy from Nairobi who's coming to see me in my clinic in Nairobi, and he has high blood pressure and his vitamin D level is really good, I'm probably going to default to medication on him sooner than the other guy. Now, you understand that nuance, but guess what? The people who listen to this, who are not doctors, say, I don't understand what Jack just said. And this is the whole point of my system. Doctors will begin to understand what's really important. So, for example, the single most important thing for high blood pressure should be education that's done in the operatory. So, for example, I would sit down that guy in Toronto who's from Somalia and make him watch the TED Talk of Dr. Richard Weller from 10 years ago. He's a dermatologist that basically said, it seems like most of the people in Edinburgh are dying of problems related to hypertension because they don't have enough nitric oxide production because they don't get enough sun because we live at the 59th latitude. So my discussion with the patient would start right away. Tell me what you do. Oh, you're an IT worker. Okay. So tell me about your day. In other words, you're doing an environmental biohack on them as part of their demographics, something that never gets done in a centralized system or even a functional medicine system. Well, tell me how long you spend under blue light and around non-native EMF. Okay, so that explains why your vitamin D is 13. Okay, and your blood pressure today was 159 over 87. I will tell you what I think we need to do first. Let's mitigate your environment as best we can. We'll get you some blue blockers. We'll have you wear turtlenecks, cover your body all over. And I'm going to ask you to go out and see the sunrise every day. I'm going to ask you to try to ground. And I'm going to have you try to get at least an hour of sun on 80% of your skin. I want you to be like Uncle Jack is right now. And then I'd like to see you back in 1 month to see what your blood pressure is. I'd also give them a blood pressure cuff, teach them how to do their blood pressure at home, because I'd want them in a book to write down for me what the trend is and how much time they spent in the sun. I'd introduce them to the vitamin D app that Michael Holik has. I'd explain how to use that in their latitude. And then they'd come back and see me in a month. If the blood pressure showed a good trend, then I would tighten up the environment more. If they did everything that they were supposed to do, then I would consider first generation pharmacotherapeutics for that patient.
Yeah. Okay. So Jack, for example, for this patient, would you take the test, like, for example, mitochondrial haplotyping, or any of that sort? Or
I wouldn't do that initially. Okay. Because I would say just from the initial demographics, if the guy tells me he's from Somalia and he lives in Toronto, I already know he's mismatched. Then when I hear that he's in the IT business, then he's really mismatched. So what do I want to do? Decentralization works on the simple things. The doctor already knows that the patient's mismatched, so let's try to fix some of the mismatches. Because like the second visit, I'm probably going to turn them onto a spurty light with an infrared A.
Right.
I'm going to do other things. I'm probably not going to default straight to medication. But in this example that you've asked me to give you, what you're basically going to see is there's gradated steps before I go to Big Pharma. And then when I go to Big Pharma, what am I going to do? I'm not going to call the pharmacist at Sam's or Walgreens. Who am I going to call? I'm going to call a compound pharmacist to make the first generation drug for him most cheaply. In fact, in my system, this is where Big Pharma is not going to like me. I want to support pharmacists that run their own pharmacy. And I would like the medicines compounded directly for the patient. And the reason why is this will explain to doctors truly what the difference is between Big Pharma and the way pharmaceuticals should be dealt with. Just the way people understand farm to table. Like when you buy a steak from Safeway in the United States, you have no idea anything about that steak. The same thing is true about your drugs when you go to Walgreens. But when you have a guy who's a compound pharmacist who actually can make the drug and titrate it to the effect and then discuss that with both the doctor and the patient, then guess what? You have a team of 3 people that are all working. They all have skin in the same game.
So you reminded me of something when you said compounding pharmacy. When I started the troches for methylene blue, I actually had it scored. It's scored, right? You could divide it in quarters so that you could actually titrate the dose, right? And why I'm smiling is that our troches prescriptions are actually made, manufactured, supervised by a compounding pharmacist, and that's that's the difference with us. Well, Jack, I'm trained in pharmacology, and I'm a physician. I don't want. I want a precision dose, pharmaceutical grade agents. But the question that I had actually after that little digression is. What do you do for if the patient doesn't follow your compliance? What do you do with poor compliance?
Yeah, that's something that people probably won't like about decentralized medicine.
Yeah,
decentralized medicine mandates that skin's in the game. If skin's not in the game,
yeah.
Let me ask you the flip side of this, Ted. What does nature do when an animal doesn't do what it's supposed to do?
Kills it off.
That's it. So if the patient decides that they want to let their blood pressure continue to go high, drink Malbec at night, eat dinner at 10 o'clock at night, and go out and boom boom and snort coke and drink alcohol, I'm not going to stop them. Why? Because remember what the key for decentralization is, Ted? It's medical freedom. That person has a choice to make themselves sick and to kill themselves. What they don't have a choice is to hold my feet to the fire by that choice.
Well, Jack, let's get to the parts where you really have gotten a lot of people talking, and these are the various topics that are actually interwoven. And the one thing that I remember, Jack, the quote that I remember Jack with is Brian Greene's "All you are is a bag of particles acting out the laws of physics." And each time I see this quote, I said, that's how I remember when people ask me how to explain Jack, that's what I do. I said, take a look. His fundamentals are in quantum physics, specifically biophysics, and then it's light, water, and magnetism, So, and biophotons and the water as a Faraday cage and, the bone as a semiconductor, all of these are coming off from physics. So how does, the decentralized medicine system actually benefit from taking a look at health that is actually getting optimized or getting helped by the foundation, which is biophysics or quantum biophysics?
Yeah, I think in the new paradigm that I think is coming, whether it be either in a zip code, a hospital system, or a neighborhood, or even a country, the thing that has to happen for the decentralized, even say the other doctors that are interested, say decentralized or functional medicine doctors, you have to go back to where the story really begins. And you don't have to go all the way back, like I did with Huberman. Yeah, I would just start the story with Albert St. George. And, you'll probably laugh with this because that he's one of the fathers of biochemistry. And the reason why this story, I would use the internet. Here's a shocker for you. I would use technology this way, not through EHR, but through the kind of thing that we're doing right now. Right. I would actually make doctors watch videos and listen to lessons about the history of medicine when we went off the rails so they understand where it comes out. And Albert St. George in 1937 won the Nobel Prize for both vitamin C and the TCA cycle. The irony is, in 1937, Albert St. George was wrong about the TCA cycle, but that didn't matter because his idea was so fundamental that the Nobel Prize committee thought it was such a huge leap that it needed to be rewarded. And they were correct on that. But here's the difference between Albert St. George and a lot of other Nobel Prize winners who actually were wrong, like the Peter Mitchells of the world. Albert St. George in 1941, this is 4 years after he won the Nobel Prize, sat in Budapest and talked to a group of medical students and said, I think the next level to biochemistry is biophysics. And I believe that because every single thing that I've looked at in the TCA cycle inside of mitochondria has told me that proteins seem to have an electronic structure, meaning a solid state structure. He's the first centralized MD that had ever said something like this at that time. And the reason why it was revolutionary is because the quantum mechanics and biochemistry were still in their formative phases from 1905 all the way up until really the 60s. And where St. George was going, he was telling people that, look, I know what I taught the world is important. I know that it was a giant step forward, but I also know that I'm wrong. And that was what he was saying between the words. And he was telling future medical students, I want you to go out and find what the next level above biochemistry is, because I know there's another level. I know it from my work. And he told medical students to do that. So one of the medical students who saw that talk was Robert O. Becker. And Robert O. Becker actually took this great advice to heart. What happened between St. George and Becker? Well, it turned out in 1954, Krebs actually found out that fumaric and succinic acid weren't the most important things like St. George said. It was actually citric acid that was the big one.
Right.
And they gave a Nobel Prize in 1954 to Krebs, and we now know it as the TCA or Krebs cycle, not the Albert St. George cycle. But most people, Ted, don't even know that history around this foundational issue. So what did Becker do? Becker went out through a series of experiments from 1955 through 1967 and definitively proved that Albert St. George was right, that we actually are run by semiconductors. Just about every protein in our body is a semiconductor. But there's different types. There's P semiconductors, there's N semiconductors, there's narrow band semiconductors, there's wide band gap semiconductors. Water has different effects on here. The type of semiconductor that we're built around uses water as its intermediary. The ones that are silicon-based or germanium-based that Silicon Valley uses doesn't work in water. They're fundamentally different. So you cannot have someone who's a semiconductor engineer, who's an expert in narrow band gap, talk to biophysicists who should be experts in wide band gap semiconduction, because they're radically different. Now, where do they both coalesce? They both coalesce in melanin. Why? Because melanin is a huge wideband semiconductor. Now, even the guys in Silicon Valley, the condensed matter physicists, are going, hey, this is the most amazing thing ever. Because, for the last 20 years, everybody's been focused in on graphene, okay, which is a form of carbon.
Right.
Graphene also doesn't work great with water. But it turns out melanin does. Melanin is not affected by water at all. And this makes it something that is an enigma to the experts in Silicon Valley. And they know that it's important. Well, the reason why this is a big deal, what Becker did, is it's the same thing that St. George did to Becker. And what I'm saying to you right now, since Becker was wiped off the mat by the industrial military complex, we have not had an opportunity for your students, my students, Huberman students, to know the story that I just told you. Why? Because those young minds may say, what Jack is fundamentally saying is actually the same thing that St. George said to doctors in the 1940s, that there is another level to what we've been taught in centralization that we all need to aspire to. And I don't know, Ted, if everything that I've ever said in my public and professional career is correct, but I can tell you this. I know it's a lot more correct than a guy like Fauci. I know it's a lot more correct than a guy like Collins. I know it's a lot more correct than Walensky. I know the people that are in power today, what they're telling people is absolutely incorrect. And the way that I know definitively I'm right is the public health has done horrible since the 1960s. In fact, since we've embraced technology, it's gotten worse and worse and worse. But we were sold the idea, especially from guys like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, that if we introduced more technology. And then we had the Googles of the world come and say, hey, let's collect the data. Let's have my ex-wife run 23andMe. Let's do algorithm medicine. Let's do big data collection. Well, guess what? We're now 20 years into that, and we're fucking sicker than we've ever been. We're worse. Yeah. So guess what? It's not out of the realm of possibility of what I'm saying to you right now, that when you do the same shit over and over and over again and you expect a different result, but you keep getting terrible public health, you got to think about what Einstein said. Yeah. Maybe you need to think about what you're doing, because that's insanity. And that is the point that I'm trying to bring to people about asking the next level question. And I'll be the first one to say this, Ted, and I think you know this. There is going to be things in my paradigm today in 2023 that I know are going to probably turn out to be wrong. I know there's going to be things in your paradigm that are also going to turn out to be wrong. Yeah. But you know what the key thing about me and you is? We're not afraid of being wrong. We're not. That's what science is all about. It's about two guys coming on a podcast or going to a medical meeting and telling each other, you're fucking assholes, and this is the reason why, and we fight it out, and we make the case. That's what fundamentally morbidity and mortality conferences are when doctors go. This is the big wizard. Like, people always ask me, what's the big thing in medicine that patients would be stunned about knowing, or even the politicians would be stunned about knowing? That every doctor goes through M&M conference, and none of you are allowed in it. And there's a reason you're not allowed in it, because if you saw what really went on in M&M conference, you would be very, very happy that other doctors take other doctors apart. So what has Uncle Jack done for 20 years on the internet? I've basically brought the idea of M&M to the internet. I've brought it to Twitter. I've brought it to medical meetings. Ted knows he brought me to Balasan Island in front of 3,000 Filipino doctors, the Minister of Health, and I got in front of the stage and told them, you're fucking wrong. And I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. And you know what? I ran this program in my head, and Ted gave me free reign to do it. So did the people that put this on, because my idea was, not everybody's going to like this message, but this is going to be, and going to remind those doctors that this is like an M&M conference. We are going to sit down and we're going to have a discussion. And the people that put this conference on, I'm going to tell you, I knew, and not going to mention any of them by names, but they also gave me free range. And to this very day, Ted knows that I respect and love those people, just like he does, because they were trying to do what I'm trying to do now, what Ted's trying to do. We're old guys now, but we're not done. We are not done pushing this envelope. And decentralization is something that every patient needs. It's something that every doctor needs. It's something that every health system in the world needs. And it's not going to be comfortable. And that's the reason why I tell even my own members, when I say things you don't like, I tell them to embrace the suck, embrace the chaos. Why? Because it's only through the chaos and the mistakes that we learn the truth. And that's the whole point of M&M conference. You have to learn what's good and what's bad. You cannot know good without bad. And you cannot understand the depth of bad until you've sampled the good.
So Jack, this leads me to actually a lot of questions, but the key thing that in my mind is that you said that we're already old people, right? But we're just really, really wanting to push this whole thing. But for me, it's like, now, how do we change two things? How do we change medical education then so that these things are included, number one? And number two, how do we make this younger generation who is actually in medical service with patients, etc., catch up with the fundamentals of what we need to do?
That's easy. You're actually doing it right now with me, Ted, and you don't even realize it. You did it when we're in the Philippines. Every time I do a podcast, I do it. Look, this is the easiest part. The use of technology, that's the best, is actually connecting and talking to doctors just like this, doing a Zoom call, and then saying, okay, let's pick a topic we're going to talk about today. Let's talk about This is the decentralized perspective. This is the centralized. This is the functional medicine. And then having the competing people talk about it, what the pros and cons are, and then you get to it. And then you decide as the person on the other end, you know what? This idea that Jack had about using Richard Weller's talk, the TED Talk, that's a resource that's on the internet for free, but we're not utilizing that at all. We don't need to reproduce it at all. We just need to let other doctors see it. Or if you did, a lecture, like, my lectures that I've done in Vermont that have been extremely popular, you could pop those on and say, okay, everybody thinks about food like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Well, in that lecture in Vermont in 2016, I said, no, it's an electromagnetic barcode of photosynthesis. And everybody's head went, well, guess what? We don't need to reproduce that. It's already there for people to see. The problem is, Ted, if it becomes pretty obvious because the same doctor keeps coming up to the medical board because they keep prescribing, I don't know, say a diet high in linoleic acid because they like canola oil and safflower oil, and it becomes very clear that they watch this and they don't believe it. They still believe the dominant paradigm that was born in around Ansel Keys. Right now, they're protected in the centralized system. They won't be in my system.
Yeah. So Jack, for example, the one thing, there's one thing that I know is actually difficult to understand for many doctors, but they can be educated in it, the existence of wide-band semiconductors and so on. What did you think of the work of Michael Levin on bioelectricity and the DNA is the one simply specifying, what ion channels are there?
I don't think it's complete. I don't think, to be quite honest with you, I don't think Levin truly understands some of the foundational stuff that I teach. Like, if you put his ideas and my ideas together, you would actually see this is the basics of biophysics. Like, in other words, if you want to know what manipulation of the atomic lattice inside a cell fundamentally does, it basically takes electromagnetic photons and breaks them into electric and magnetic fields and uses them. What's the electric field in a cell? It's the DC electric current. What's the magnetic effect? It's actually free radicals. I mean, that's why free radicals have one unpaired electron. You put them in an EPR machine and you see them. And Ted, you know this better than anybody, that the things that you and I were taught about RNS and ROS is so out of date, because of the people that originally did it. It has such a negative connotation. I'm going to tell you, you can't live with ROS or RNS. The key is understanding how they're quantized by the light in the environment you're in, or the light that's made inside your mitochondria through metabolism. And therein lies the key. I would look at Levin's problem the way I look at the great pyramids of Giza. You go and look at Giza and go, this is absolutely spectacular. But to this very day, 5,000 years later, we have no earthly idea besides a tomb what the hell the pyramids did. And there's so many ideas that Levin has that are great, but this is what I would tell you. If his ideas don't improve the public health, I don't want to fucking talk about them. Why? Because decentralization, what did I tell you before? I'm always going to bring you back to this key. Survival of the fittest was Darwin's paradigm. What's my paradigm? Survival of the wisest. The wisest doctors are going to be the people that have the best outcomes. Okay? So I don't want to hear anybody's theories until I see return on equity from the healthcare system that we decide to go in. And I think right now, the biggest RCT that needs to be done is put an RCT up against decentralization in networks, because that's effectively what E equals MC squared is, and the photoelectric effect. When a randomized controlled clinical trial on lipids shows that it blows away the photoelectric effect, I will write prescriptions for statins.
Okay, so the question that I have here then is, for our listeners and audience out there, I always love to because as you can see, Jack is really a brilliant guy, and he will take you right back to fundamentals, and his fundamentals is really on the properties of physics, right? We are basically in light, water, and magnetism territory. And you could see here where what he's actually saying is, well, we have to manage when we're taking a look at ourselves, our health, etc. There's the biophotons in our body that need to get managed. Where to source the electrons for them. So when you understand Jack that way, it becomes easy to follow what he's getting at. It's because there's a gap between the current system today and what Jack is trying to say is like, here's the fundamentals of what you should know, and here's how it ramifies upwards and affects your health. Right?
Correct.
So when you start
we can use technology to make that quantum leap. Why? Because all of us, especially last 3 years, have lived through Zoom calls and everything else. People can do their jobs this way now. I know that I can teach, and I'm going to tell you this, Ted, because you asked me this question. I want to make sure I really hammer it home. I believe when I take somebody who has basic science training like we all get in medicine, chiropractic school, naturopathic medicine, it's not going to take too long. In fact, I will tell you, I was sitting in a meeting, a healthcare meeting at a very high level, and I had an 18-year-old girl in the audience, and she was going like this, champion, putting her head up, and she goes, "Dr. Jack, please just tell me, because what you're saying, everybody in my family is doctors. They think I'm crazy. What should I do to become a doctor?" I said, very simply, call up Jim L. Khalili and go to the University of Surrey, do 2 years in biophysics, learn as much as you can, and then come see me, and I'll teach you to be a neurosurgeon in 1 year. Because I can distill neurosurgery in 1 year that you really need to know in a decentralized fashion. But guess what? Centralized, oh, no, you need 7 years of neurosurgery. And, there's so much that you have to learn.
If the people here don't know, I also respect Jack because Jack is also a dentist before he became a neurosurgeon. And I have a great respect for dentists. My sister and my nephew and niece are dentists. So I have great respect for dentists. And then
dentists are tooth brain surgeons. That's the way I look at it. Remember,
yes, I agree.
The whole goal is to stay out of the nerves of the tooth. But people don't look at it like I look at it. And the thing is, the teeth are really, really important. Like I use the skin in the eyes because they're easy to examine. But there is so much information that can glean from the oral cavity and from the dentition and the periodontium and how it relates to other diseases. One of the things that I'm happy about in my career, when I started this in the early 80s, is I remember periodontists telling me and teaching me in dental school that we could actually tell about heart disease just from the state of the periodontium. And at that time in centralized medicine, that was considered, that's crazy quack talk. Now it's not. So I've seen in 30 years that something that was quack talk is now firmly accepted. And I guess the things that you and I are talking about, I don't think the leap between decentralization and centralization or even functional medicine is as big as you think. I just think that the way we teach people this over the internet and who we get to teach it, like I'm probably going to piss a lot of people off when I say this, but I've had a group of my ex-members go and start this I guess you would call it an online classroom and try to get certification for people to do this. I fundamentally have a huge problem with this because of what I've shared with you in this video. If you are not professionally trained, you have no business in teaching the lay public anything when it comes to affecting someone else's health. I believe, and this is the key thing with decentralization, that doctors have to judge doctors. And when I use the term doctor, I'm pouring a lot of people into that. But when you're not trained and you know a lot about healthcare, but not a ton, and see, that's where I would put Michael Levin into this situation. I don't think that that's the type of system that we should go for. I think that's the type of system that we have with board certification. And you and I both know board certification really is a professional guild that's done to protect the people that are members of it, not in a good sense either. A lot of times they protect bad doctors. I just don't think getting training that way is the way to do it. I want to see it very open. I want to see a kid like this girl go and get trained somewhere by real scientists and then come back and have a clinician work with her. And then she goes out and then teaches. You know how, like, when you and I were both young doctors, we used to have a saying in residency, see one, teach one, do one. That is fundamentally a decentralized idea. And we have gotten so far away from that in residency now. And when I listen to program directors now talk about, oh, well, we can't do that because it led to a lot of bad problems, I'm sorry. I totally disagree with that, because I look at the quality of doctors that are produced now is they are woeful in helping the public health. This is the reason why I go after people in academia, because if they were right, everybody should be walking around healthy as all get out. And they're not. So that's the reason we have to stop listening to dumbasses.
Well, Jack, a thing that came to me, in terms of evolution, which you mentioned earlier, is like one of the principles of universal Darwinism is actually survival of the most stable. Does there need to destabilize the centralized medicine paradigm, or is the mere fact of establishing decentralized medicine destabilize it by itself?
Guys, actually, Ted, I'm going to answer this probably and shock you. I think centralized medicine has destabilized itself over the last 3 years. I think they're doing enough for me. In fact, I would tell you the way I look at decentralized medicine through COVID is the way the Egyptians learned about water and how to break an obelisk out. They knew that if they could get water in a certain crack, that's all it would take for their stones to do it. They were very, very crafty. And I think Buckminster Fuller is resonating in my head when I answer this question to you. They're doing a great job taking apart their own paradigm, because guys like Fauci, like, for example, what the CDC and the FDA just announced that, oh, let's give people more boosters. I mean, after looking at the aftermarket data, anybody who says let's give them more boosters, they need to have their head examined. That would be the stupidest thing you could ever do. Why? Because they didn't work the first time, and they're certainly not going to work again. But you have to realize incentives dictate the outcomes. The CDC and the FDA, these are people who are incentivized for big pharma. So, of course, they're going to tell you that. But the problem is the public doesn't look at the CDC or the FDA the way you and I do. We know what they are. They are levers that control the centralized paradigm. And those things, I mean, the simple thing to do, like in a country like the United States, is I would just tell people do not comply with anything the CDC or the FDA says. In fact, I would tell you to do exactly the opposite, because that's exactly what they deserve. Their information has been so bad for so long on so many different things. Let me give you an analogy. I think you'll probably chuckle at this. So I was in a foreign country not that long ago in front of a group of very influential people, and I made the case, the very provocative story, that if I was to tell you that your health would be better by being under the care of the Colombian cartel for cocaine versus the CDC or FDA, would you believe it? And of course, everybody in the crowd just got a big smile on their face like you did, and they laughed and this and that. Well, they stopped laughing, Ted, after the next slide that showed up that showed how many people died of cocaine and fentanyl deaths in the last 3 years compared to how many people died from COVID and from COVID vaccinations. And you guess what? Everybody stopped laughing then. So when I told them the initial premise that I made to you sounded preposterous. Why? I understood. But you know what people don't understand about decentralization? Just put some sunshine on the data, on the facts. And all of a sudden, people will be able to make their own decision, because guess what? If you sit down with me and you're my patient in the operatory and I tell you this story and I show you that slide that I showed them, all of a sudden you begin to realize, well, if we made this big a mistake with that, what kind of mistake are we making with statins? What kind of mistake are we making with stents? What kind of mistake are we making with, I don't know, cabbage versus non-operative treatment? What kind of mistake are we making with fusions And this is the point, Ted. The point is the decentralized perspective has never been given a chance to show its power. Okay? And the one thing that infuriates me is that every single person that will ever listen to this video is here listening to it because Mother Nature allowed you to be here. 5,000 years ago, there was no centralized doctors. Okay? It was nature. And we are here because of that medicine. And we are the most arrogant, silly talking monkeys to not realize that. Even when we have data from 5,000 years ago that the Egyptians put a sphinx that looks to the east, grounded to the ground in the middle of a desert. They were telling us something. There was a reason they named their god after the sun. Now, did they have it all right? No, just like I'm telling you on this podcast, I don't think I have it all right. But do I think that the Egyptians had more right about decentralized health than the FDA and the CDC have right now? That's exactly what I'm saying.
So, Jack, we're on the subject of regulatory systems and so on. So do we require separate regulatory systems then? Or since the doctors are policing themselves, etc., who's going to police the policemen?
You mean the doctors? The doctors will police. The doctors are going to police the doctors. That's the only way to weed out the good and the bad eggs. And it can't be set up in the system the way we have it in the United States. The problem in the United States, since I'm in that system, if you're a good doctor, the system works good. The problem is if you're a bad doctor, the system protects you. That can't happen. In my system, bad doctors have to be weeded out. Good doctors have to be they have to be more vocal. In other words, what I'm saying to you, Ted, that I think the public won't understand who listens to this podcast, just remember the greatest M&M conferences that you ever heard. It's when someone's getting eviscerated. And then what happens after the evisceration happens, everybody comes and then teaches that person what they missed. Guess what? That's a lesson that the doctor never forgets. Why? Because we can tear each other apart, but we can also build it back together and say, look, this is where you made the mistake. Never let this happen again. This person lost their life because of this decision. And you need to understand why they did it. These are the kind of decisions and discussions that politicians, that hospital administrators, and the lay public, they've never experienced, Ted. Most people would not understand some of the things that I've seen and experienced in M&M conferences, but guess what? As part of my system, there's going to be a lot more M&M conferences. And we are going to find good doctors. And we are going to make sure those good doctors want to teach the other bad doctors. And if the bad doctors don't want to learn, those bad doctors will become lawyers and politicians.
Well, I just remind this is I remember during clinical clerkship and internship where we did our morbidity and mortality audits was in a hall called Guazon Hall in the hospital, and everyone called it Guazon Hell because it is really hell when you're inside there and you are the one presenting your case. But anyway, Jack, I want to switch gears now and clarify some of the things that people might have heard out there, concepts and pronouncements that you've made so that it's clearer for them when they hear you speak. Like, for example, you said that evolution occurs through photolithography. So what exactly do you mean by that? Evolution occurs through photolithography.
Well, I think it's a great question, but it's a question that I think for you to get the full answer, you have to truly parse and listen to what I said to Huberman over that 10-hour interview. Basically, prior to the Cambrian explosion, chlorophyll was probably the single biggest semiconductor. Remember, what does photolithography mean? How is a semiconductor made? Okay? Photo is the light part of it. Well, that's exactly what chlorophyll effectively is. It was the first true successful semiconductor on the planet. And that's the reason why photosynthesis predates mitochondrial respiration. We know that. There's no question about it. The interesting thing is, at the same time, while chlorophyll was being built, so was melanin and so was hemoglobin. It turns out that hemoglobin took a little bit longer to get perfected than chlorophyll did, okay? Right. Hemoglobin's gone through multiple rounds, what I'd like to call 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, until where it gets now. In fact, even in the 32 file of Complex Life Now, we still have different hemoglobins. In fact, in us, the silly talking monkeys, our fetal hemoglobin is nucleated, our adult isn't. There's a reason for that, biophysically. Not that I want to get into it, but the point that I'm trying to make to you is that evolutionary atavism is still present, and it's there every time we see it. The problem is people don't think about it the way I think about it. Just like melanin, I try to bring up to Huberman in the podcast, if you listen to it, I was amazed talking to him that the animal that he uses in his lab at Stanford is a cephalopod. I don't think he really understood that cephalopods came around 550 to 500 million years ago, and they scored out ink, and ink is filled with 70% melanin. And I said, that's human brain 1.0. All the light you see on a cephalopod when they're in the water, they're emitting to the environment, and they're keeping their melanin as a mechanism to save their life. I said, what's happened now, let's say 550 million years later? When I open someone's head, I don't see the light going off. The light is contained in the system, and the melanin is locked up in a gene called POMC through alpha MSH. I said, that is the photolithography that's gone on from cephalopods today. Here's the interesting thing. The conditions of existence from cephalopods to us today still are good enough that cephalopods and silly talking monkeys can actually still exist on the planet today. In other words, it hasn't changed as much as you think, but what really did change, the conditions of existence from 3.8 billion years ago to the Cambrian explosion was massive. It was the electromagnetic environment that changed tremendously. So this is the black swan mitochondriac idea that you've seen me timestamp in everybody. I've timestamped it in you. I've timestamped it in everybody I talk to, because it's the electromagnetic footprint of the environment that performs the photolithography that makes the semiconductors. And the ones that show proof of work for physiology, those are the ones that are highly conserved. So something you said earlier that I didn't interrupt you on that I wanted to, but I'm going to say it now, is the hardware inside a cell, the DNA and RNA, is the thing that's designed to be stable by evolution, because that is the semiconductor fabrication plant. That's Applied Materials. That's Intel. Okay? The mitochondrial DNA is actually the engineers in Silicon Valley that say, we've got a problem in the environment that these silicon, or I should say these semiconductors aren't fixing. We need to do something to change the atomic lattice to see if we can improve it. So in modern times, what would be that idea? The first idea is neuromelanin was likely the first melanin. Then we got eumelanin. Then we got pheomelanin. Why? You got these other versions of melanin because they were solutions to changes that occurred in the electromagnetic environment. What is that change in the electromagnetic environment that you and I have taught people about? Well, you only need pheomelanin or eumelanin when you leave the East African Rift and you have L0, L1, L2, and L3, and you go up to the 51st latitude, and guess what? Your melanin can't be dark like it is in the substantia nigra. Actually, you need a different color. Why? Because terrestrial sunlight is different at that level. Therefore, we innovate blue eyes. Therefore, we innovate light skin. Therefore, we get the melanin out of our skin and put it inside of us so that we can do things with. And what are the remnants of this idea to this very day that I may be right? Well, remember, you're an aficionado of mitochondrial biology like I am. Remember, the Homo that was right before us was the Neanderthals. We still have some of the Neanderthals in us. What people don't know about Neanderthals, they got the name Neanderthal because it's the Valley of Neanderthal in Germany. We haven't found a skeleton of them above the 51st latitude. What else don't people know? They had 125 grams more brain tissue than us, and their eyes were bigger than ours. Guess why? They were optimized for a better light environment. And when they got to the 51st latitude, all of a sudden, they weren't the best primate on the planet. It turned out the silly talking monkey that also came up out of Africa was a little bit better. Why? Because it didn't have as much brain tissue in its head, and it made it more survivable at higher latitudes. Now, remember I told you about decentralized medicine. Where is the proof of work in this idea? Why is this important that I'm taking you through this exercise? Because this is an exercise that I'm going to teach millions of doctors about as soon as we change medical freedom laws in certain places. It's very simple. The boreal forest sits on the top of the planet in the northern hemisphere. The reason we don't have one in the southern hemisphere is because Antarctica sits at the pole and there is no continents around it. The Southern Ocean is there. So the experiment that you need to know is photosynthesis only works at the 59th or 60th latitude, and then guess what happens? It goes by the wayside. That's the reason why when you take a trip to Kirkwall in the top of Scotland, above Edinburgh, or you go to Iceland, or you go to Greenland, you will see lava flows that have been on this planet for 3 or 4 billion years that are fucking barren. And the reason they're barren is because photosynthesis doesn't happen there. That's what dirt is. Dirt is dead plants. Then when you come to a place like El Salvador, that's only been on the planet for 80 million years, the dirt is hugely thick. It's got clay. Why? Because photosynthesis at the 13th latitude, I mean, you piss on the ground and you make a coconut tree. It's the same thing that happens in the Philippines where the coconuts grow there. You know that. But here's the interesting part of the story. What people don't realize is that what I just taught you, the boundary of photosynthetic quantum yield is the 60th north latitude. What is the quantum yield for humans? The 51st latitude. And that story has been proven in the fossil record. But guess what? Centralized systems and functional medicine systems do not tell their patients that maybe living at the 59th latitude isn't a good fucking idea. So let's scale that even further back. Can you live at Manila at an equatorial environment, but say you are a Filipino woman who thinks it's a good idea to have an umbrella, wear clothes all over, wear Chanel sunglasses, sunscreen, and then take glutathione injections from some stupid-ass functional medicine guy? Guess what? You just recapitulated the experiment that I just told you about the Neanderthals. But you know what the problem is, Ted? Nobody is teaching people what I just told you. And when you said to me, Jack, how are we going to take centralized and functional medicine people and get them to understand this? You and me, my friend, just did it in the last 2 hours. Don't think that this video won't be used somewhere down the road.
Yes. Well, Jack, there's also something that I wanted you to discuss, which is, I think, very germane, especially to a lot of parents who are now raising their kids. And there's something that you said that was quite alarming to me, where, I said, are we really in an extinction event with the way we are in the world?
Of course we are. I mean, this shouldn't shock anybody. If you take a good look behind me, you will not see it right now, but you know that it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon at the 28th latitude. The sun is out. That is the EMF that we're optimized to. Ted, since 1874, the light that we've chose to live under was Edison's light. Then we built the AC power grid by Tesla in 1893 that was turned on at the World's Fair. And all of a sudden, we thought it was a good idea to have artificial light during the day. But here's the big one, at night. And guess what? That's an extinction event. That's an extinction event for anything that has a mitochondria. And guess what? That story still is not fully developed in the centralized or functional medicine world. But Uncle Jack has been saying that for 20 years. And Uncle Jack doesn't want Ted to be upset by it. I told you before, embrace the suck, because the only way we're going to get people to understand that they have to be smarter about the way they use technology is to think about this. So what's my analogy, decentralization, for this? Steve Jobs. Everybody knows what Steve Jobs was, the founder of Apple. He coined the term in our lexicon, the laptop. You know why? Because he put the computer on his lap. Then every time he gave a talk for Macintosh people, you always saw him with the Levi jeans. He had the worn out pocket on the back, first for his iPod and then for his iPhone. So, Ted, tell me what he died from. A retroperitoneal cancer.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. Is that between the laptop and the phone back there? Did you read his Isaacson biography when he told the story in the iPad 2 that he put an infrared detector in the device and never marketed it? Did you ever ask yourself why? Because he knew. Okay? He knew that if a kid touched that iPad that he had to turn off the RF and the microwave. So he knew. And then what else did he say in the Isaacson biography? My kids are not going to use my devices. So if they're not good enough for his kids, and they certainly weren't good for Jobs, everybody who's listening to this think that Jobs is a great guy. Let me ask you a question, Ted, about what I said to you 2 hours ago about decentralized medicine. Isn't it about the return on equity? The return on equity for Steve Jobs is 56 years old. He has a fucking $9 billion estate. He's fucking dead. Me and you are both over 56 years old. We are still kicking ass and taking names. So let me ask you a question. How successful really was Steve Jobs from a decentralized perspective? And then when you consider that he's probably killed and hurt more people than the asteroid did 65 million years ago. Do you think from that perspective, from that facet of which I look, that what I said is disturbing at all? Or may it be I just gave you the same idea that I told my friends who listened to me about the Colombian drug cartel versus the FDA and the CDC? Did I not say exactly the same thing? But why does Uncle Jack do this? I told you the answer. It's an M&M conference. I want you to know exactly what you're doing. Because when you know exactly what you're doing, Ted, Decentralized Doctor is going to allow you to continue to wear the headphones and be inside and talk to me. Okay?
Right.
I'm not going to tell you, Ted, you made this as a conscious choice. I know that you did that. But it's my duty, if you're my patient, for me to tell you, if you continue to do this over and over and over again, I'm going to have to fire you as a patient, and I'm going to send you to Peter Adia, or I'm going to send you, to one of the other losers that's out there in centralized medicine. I mean, I treat patients, clinicians, just the way nature does. If you don't follow her laws, what is the biologic toll you get? It's mitochondrial disease. And that mitochondria changes the translation of the genome. Guess what? That's exactly what it does. It's an electromagnetic event. That's what technology is. It's the same thing that happened when the asteroid hit the planet. People ask me all the time, what was the electromagnetic event in the KT event? An asteroid that was 6 miles wide blocked the sun for a period of time. That's the key. In other words, if you block the sun, that's a really bad problem. The flip side of that is if you have light at night that we create and you do it that way, that's additive to the problem. That will get you extinction. We will turn back into, I think you'll probably remember this conversation we had in Orlando, that I said if we had an electromagnetic Meg machine, that there's a possibility that we could actually get monkeys to talk. Remember that?
Yes.
And I actually really believe that. And it's the truth. Why? Because of what I told you right here. We don't realize how the electromagnetic footprint in our environment has changed radically in the last 150 years. And that is the single biggest lever that is ruining our mitochondrial biology. And that mitochondrial biology reacts by doing things that the RNA and DNA shouldn't be doing. It's designed to be quiet and stable so that it can stay as a photolithography plant that makes the best semiconductors that nature has come up with for 3.8 billion years. But guess what? When you start using Microsoft, Meta, Apple, and you do it to a great degree, you are messing up with the key features of what makes you you.
So let me get to one of my favorite topics, Jack, which is psychedelics. Uh, does that enhance anything like a biophoton emission, biophoton capture, or what does it do? I just want to give a background to our listeners here that by the way, when Jack says in the nervous system, in the brain, the melanin, etc., I'd like to remind them that in the embryology, the brain is actually derived from a fold of the skin, right? So it's derived from ectodermal tissue or skin tissue. So brain tissue and skin tissue are actually derived from the same origins.
So is melanin.
And so is melanin. And so, if you go back to that, you'll see what Jack is saying in terms of embryology. The other thing that is actually an engineering question when I used to handle PhD bioengineering students is that, how are you going to wire, the brain with the skin? And since they have no idea of embryology, they sort of devised all sorts of ways to do it. For me, it's an exercise to think about biological processes. But to get to the question at hand is, so does it enhance biophoton emission, Jack, or biophoton capture? What does it do?
Actually does both, but here's the interesting part. What people miss, people who have a positive connotation for psychedelics don't understand that the process is quantized. So the argument that I gave to you before about RNS and ROS, it's the same thing. So it means the same key opens up the door to heaven and hell. So if you have somebody who has trash mitochondria, utilizing psychedelics may help them, but it also may destroy them. So DMT, especially because it's a derivative of melanin breakdown, with hypoxia, you need to realize that the system that controls this, meaning the levers of the boxcars and biochemistry tied to this, are all light frequencies. So if you live a life where you're breaking all of nature's laws, you can see that my advice is going to be very careful the way you use psychedelics. Even when you're breaking those laws, will it appear to you that you actually may get a benefit? I already can tell you the answer to that is yes. Why? Because we see it with LSD, we see it with psilocybin, we see it with ketamine, we see it in the recent centralized papers that have come out with this. There is clearly an effect. The problem with seeing the effect is understanding that the effect needs to be quantized. So you brought that up. Does it change biophoton emission? We know that without a doubt. Now, how are we really going to tell? I would tell you, Ted, we're going to have to create some of Fritz Pop's photomultipliers, very small, to put them in neural circuits to prove this. But how can I tell you that we already know? Louis de Licea, who's at Stanford University, or he was, pioneered the field of optogenetics. We now know that when we put light tags on things, we can actually see absorption and emission spectra changes. In my opinion, to know about this type of science, it's already been proven. The problem is what we don't know is we don't know the recipe. So you probably have famously heard me say in multiple other podcasts that, people who make fun of religions and Genesis, I think Genesis has the story right. 1:1 to 1:15 says it's all about light. Here's the problem with Genesis. It doesn't tell you the recipe. It's useless for us. So guys like me and guys like you, we are trying to decipher the Rosetta Stone of frequencies. I can tell you this definitively. I know that it only operates best on 1 octave of the electromagnetic spectrum, between 250 and about 300, I should say 3,000 nanometer light, which is where infrared B and C go. But there's a very interesting sliver that's in the RF range where the Schumann resonance comes. And it turns out that the interaction of light and that Schumann resonance actually create the proper quantized frequency for the things that you're asking me about. And it turns out, just like a tuning fork, when either one of these things are broken, you don't know the effect or the dose to do it unless you start to test. And the problem is you're not the ideal person to do the test on yourself. Why? This is something that you learned in quantum mechanics. It's the uncertainty principle.
Observing yourself.
Exactly right. You have to have somebody who understands functionally what you're doing. And guess what? That is not happening in the research that's done in centralized areas. Why I'm happy about the research, why I'm happy even Huberman's talking about it, is because it will eventually show that light has a tremendous effect on our biology. That step is still the quantum step that's going to link us together. The problem is, I don't want anybody listening to this podcast think, hey, well, if I'm depressed or have mental disorders, or, I constantly fly all over the world, I think it's a great idea to do a couple of dashes of psilocybin. I can't get behind that.
Mm-hmm. So how does, say it affects the biophotons, right, as psychedelics do. How do the biophotons then affect neural coherence, Jack?
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting topic. This, I would tell you, is probably the edge of my science, but the way I think it happens, there's two issues. The first issue, let's talk about electrons and protons, because remember, there's two coherent domains inside of cells. What light fundamentally does to water is charge separated. That happens because of melanin. Melanin is the most effective charge separator in the world. And if you look at photosynthesis, chlorophyll only makes 2 electrons. Melanin makes 4. It doubles the number. But it also makes oxygen and it makes hydrogen. So when you think about it like that, remember that a positively charged condensate, which is what protons are, that's a Bose-Einstein condensate. Do we use that in the brain? I believe we do. But the bigger effect of quantum coherence, which is what you're asking me, that we have a mechanism where you're basically collecting a sea of electrons. And how do we see that? That's where that other part of the electromagnetic spectrum comes in. Realize that 7.83 hertz, the Schumann resonance, where it comes from. That's when the solar wind hits the planet, the magnetosphere. It gets distributed over the magnetosphere. At the poles, you see it in aurora. That excites electrons and protons. But from 40 latitudes north and south, that's where electricity comes, shocks the Earth. And what happens there, free electrons are given off the planet, which is the reason why grounding works. But the other big thing that happens, it creates a fluid wave or a sound wave inside the ionosphere. That sound wave resonates at harmonics of 7.83 hertz. That is codified in the alpha wave that's created in our thalamus. Here's the key. You said this earlier in the podcast, over 2 hours ago. Melanin absorbs every part of the electromagnetic spectrum. There is a reason, and hopefully you'll begin to understand this, there is a reason that all 5 of our senses, and the 6th sense, which is our mitochondria, has POMC and melanin always between the environment. Why? Because it has to sense that issue. Why? Because if it doesn't, the resulting waveform that comes out of the thalamus is not going to be accurate. What does that do? That changes not only the circadian cycle, but it changes the sleep cycles. In other words, alpha, beta, theta, and delta don't do the things they have to do. And when those things don't happen, you cannot form a Bose-Einstein condensate in water. You cannot come up with a sea of electrons in water. And what happens then? Then the system isn't quantum coherent in the sense that May-Wan Ho talks about it. Now, I'm not talking about Pollack's work. I'm not even talking about Tripartite's work. What I'm saying to people, in order to be quantum coherent, the things that we've learned in physics, that things have to be as low atomic mass as possible and have a low magnetic moment, and also have a quantum spin that's half. This is the reason why deuterium is a huge problem in mitochondrial biology. Why? Mitochondria make deuterium depleted water for one reason and one reason only. E equals mc squared, and the magnetic moment of deuterium is double what it is. And when that's present, what does that mean? You cannot be quantum coherent. There's other things that we know in chemistry that happen. Like, for example, because there's a different magnetic moment and quantum spin number of deuterium versus a proton, one deuteron affects the behavior of 96 H plus atoms. Well, think about that like you're a mitochondriac. You know that the key function of what Albert St. George told us about was happening at NAD positive and NADH. It's all about cycling hydrogens through this. Effectively, what a mitochondria is a hydrogen heat engine. Well, if you lose the ability to cycle the hydrogen through there, basically the whole system goes. Who's coined that term? That's Doug Wallace, heteroplasmy. So realize that we are designed when we're awake not to be 100% quantum coherent. We are designed to be fully quantum coherent when we're asleep. And this is the reason why we have sleep paralysis. This is the reason why we don't have paralysis. This is the reason why in my earlier series that I wrote, 20 years ago, I told people that sleep was the default state, that we evolved wakefulness. And that kind of made people's heads go. But fundamentally, the reason why I tell people this is because to organize the particles that we use, which are electrons and protons, you have to have lowest atomic mass possible so that light frequencies within the visible spectrum and in the RF can actually control the coherent domains of those particles that light moves. And what does the alpha wave do? It's moving protons around in water. It affects the hydrogen bonding network in CSF.
For the sake of our audience here, there is also a fundamental thing that actually Jack was implying here. In evolution, one of the things in the origins of life is actually we actually evolved to our current states by actually being dissipative structures. We dissipate energy, and and the way we do that is we actually in the mitochondria we have a gradient. And what's, although everyone is focused on the tricarboxylic acid cycle or the citric acid cycle, what really is at the background of that, that's not seen even by many medical biochemistry students, is that this is an automated way of maintaining that gradient, that proton gradient, which then must be dissipated in order to phosphorylate your ADP. Right, so that's the background of Jack, and Jack actually very elegantly and eloquently stated what happens, when that is disturbed, and where we came from is from a default sleep state, and coherence, quantum coherence, which then defines everything that's coherent in the body, like our neurocoherence, for example, sleep, and so on. It's all stemming from that kind of physics. So, Jack, my last two questions for you is, what are the current biophoton therapies that are available or must be developed?
I think the number one thing, if you were to ask me, and I've actually put this to a couple of my engineering friends that I'm working with right now. One is in the computer business. Another one is actually, believe it or not, an airplane engineer, but he's very interested in light. I think the number one thing that we need as clinicians is that we need a tunable light that includes UVA, UVB, UVC, with infrared A that we're able to dial up from 600 to probably 1100. Would I really like to go to 3100? Probably, but it's going to be ridiculously expensive to do. But I need a light that can bring both of these lights on. Why? Because one of the things that went unsaid in what you had just said is that people don't understand that UV light controls apoptosis and infrared A light covers autophagy. You need both of these in order to go between wakefulness and sleep. And the change program, the biochemical change program that optimizes that is melatonin levels that are created, as you know, Ted, in the mitochondria. The amount of melatonin created in the mitochondria is very similar to the story of DMT in the pineal gland. It's also quantized. And it turns out that when this system is awry, when you don't have as much quantum coherence at sleep, that the system becomes screwed. How do we see that? If we had an electrode that we could put in someone's mitochondria, I tell people, I at least tell my people this, I don't know what you tell yours, but from the differential between cytochrome 1 and oxygen health is maintained between negative 400 millivolts to negative 200. When you fall below negative 200 millivolts, it's impossible to be quantum coherent, okay? So that's also when diseases begin to show up. So, for example, one of the things that I said that may confuse people, the neurologic system is partially quantum coherent while we're functioning. That is the reason why it's surrounded by water. Everybody always asks, what are the inconvenient truths? Why do I like being a brain surgeon? Because the brain is the most amazing thing out there because it's so different than any other organ. Like the basic questions that people need to ask, why is CSF surrounding the brain? Why is CSF made inside the brain? Why did the blood vessels not come in like a kidney? They come in from the outside in through the subarachnoid space. Like the reason why is this is how quantum coherence is built in that organism while it's awake. It's an organ that's built to be partially quantum coherent, and it's utilizing the electron state of water with light through the eyes and the skin through the non-visual photoreceptive system. This is all the magics that are involved in that neuroectoderm layer that you talked about. But guess what? It doesn't work well if the mitochondria doesn't make water, and it certainly doesn't work well when you're not making enough melanin to absorb enough of the light from the environment to help you. In other words, you lose your quantum coherent ability. And what do functional medicine, even mitochondriac medicine, and centralized medicine stumble on? They don't realize that keeps you outside the range of the DC electric current. In other words, the paradigm of, say, Nick Lane, where he did a great job in his books and talks about that 30 million volt charge. Well, if you don't have these processes all yoked together, your inner mitochondrial membrane may only give you 15 million charge. And when you have a 15 million charge, if you ask any physicist, if you drop the charge by half, that's also a quantized number, a quantized effect. That means that your ability to quantum tunnel with protons, electrons, or quantum entangle also drops. Why? Because of Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. Entanglement and quantum mechanics is much easier when energy isn't constrained by mass. And that's really what the story is inside of most cells. But guess what? Not too many people have biohacked the periodic table like I have. Not too many people have thought about these kind of questions. I can tell you, you're about the only person that's asked me these type of questions on a podcast. Why? Because you have an understanding that few other people have. Why? Because you've been bouncing between these levels pretty much your whole life, looking for that framework, say, tell me, tell me, tell me. And you're there now. Yeah. And you may be an old dog, but I think the main difference between me and you is you have chosen the path to be one-on-one with the patient probably more than I have. I have chosen to go down the path that I think Einstein, Feynman, and just about every theoretical physicist did. Somebody, since you and I were in the Philippines, somebody told me that they felt that I was probably the first theoretical quantum biologist, that I will sit and think about things until I figure them out, and then I like to see patients so that I can see if my insights are correct. And see, ultimately, this offends, this talk will offend many centralized doctors, but you can see I have a big smile on my face. And the reason why is because this is the reason why people hated Einstein. Because when he wrote his 4 papers, he had no experimental proof. There's no footnotes on the page. He said, given the thermodynamic givens, this has to be the way it happens. And the best part of this story is the United States government and the German government hired a guy named George Millikan to prove Einstein's wrong. Why? Because at the time, in 1900 to 1905, Germans controlled the centralized paradigm of physics, and they couldn't believe a lowly Jew who worked in Bern as a clerk could possibly write these 4 papers and possibly be right. So Philip Lenard, who was the power at that time, kind of like the Fauci of the day, said the science doesn't believe Einstein. So Einstein just kept tooling along, and it took almost 20 years for him to get his Nobel Prize. And the irony is how most people don't even know how he got it. He got it because two governments that didn't believe Einstein hired a guy to prove Einstein was wrong, and he wound up proving Einstein right. His name is George Millikan, and here's the ultimate irony. The Nobel Committee gave Millikan a Nobel Prize before they gave Einstein his. If that doesn't define to you why I have such a disdain for centralized science, nothing else will. Why? Because what did Einstein effectively do, Ted, to put a big bow on this whole podcast? He used his quantum computer to tap into the decentralized network that's behind me now, raining upon us. Like, it's raining on me now because Einstein's laughing so much. The tears are coming out of his face because I'm sharing this with another generation of people who don't know the history of how centralized science tries to keep the decentralized guys down. And to further this point, Ted, because you asked me this question earlier, this is the reason why I don't believe randomized controlled clinical trials are the gold standard. Why? Einstein proved to us it's not. In fact, I told Huberman this. I said, we don't need randomized controlled clinical trials to disprove the photoelectric effect or E equals MC squared. Why? Because they're the laws of the universe. They're not subject to a randomized controlled clinical trial. Why that makes me happy, why I'm smiling to you, is I know that, but they don't. And that's why I always tell people, if I'm wrong, if Uncle Jack's wrong, I got a lot of people behind me, and the biggest one, Mother Nature, is wrong too. I like my company. So you can stick with Fauci, you can stick with Collins, you can stick with the CDC, you can stick with the American Heart Association, you can stick with whomever you want, but I got news to you. My partner in crime, Mother Nature.
Jack, first I'd like to thank you for something that you reminded me a while ago about the millivolts. There's a book that's actually in my bedside in my beach house. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now.
You're going to have to speak up loud because it's really raining here.
Oh, you said something about voltage a while ago. And, I'm in D.C. right now, but in my beach house, I have a book that says healing is voltage. So thank you so much for actually explaining to me what's underneath that healing is voltage. It was just saying exactly what you were saying. Anything above 200, minus 200 millivolts is untenable and so on. And I was always wondering what's the reason behind that, what's the physics.
Well, I think the reason behind it actually is tied to the qualities of electrons, the qualities of protons, meaning protium, and also the other version, which is deuterium. Why? Because you need to understand something. In our system, deuterium is designed to be in the blood, but it's not designed to be in the mitochondria. So the reason that the voltage really matters actually has to do with the uncoupling gates being a carburetor to keep deuterium out of the matrix. Like if you invite deuterium to the TCA cycle that St. Georgie talked about, basically what you've just done is that's how we dial up and down the voltage. That's I guess you would call it the Lutron knob on the shade in your house, and that's why you always hear me call it a carburetor effect. And it's okay to have some deuterium inside your matrix, like when you live in an equatorial environment. Why? Because nature has a built-in thing. Those are the people that have L0, L1, L2, and L3, as you know. But is it a good plan of attack from a biophysical standpoint to be a white dude like me with freckles, with blue eyes, to have a lot of deuterium in the mix? No, it's not. And that's the reason why, famously, I made fun of Emily Deans, a psychiatrist from Harvard University, when I told her it's the stupidest idea in the world to eat a banana in Boston on December 31st. But, at the time, in the neighborhood that I was in, she tried to make me look like an asshole. And now here I am 15 years later, still laughing at her.
So, Jack, let me ask my last question, and you can take your time answering it. is the question that I ask all of my guests, and I know you have a different take on this. What 3 pieces of advice would you give our audience to live life smarter, not harder?
First thing is question everything you believe. I start every September. I'm in the process right now of writing things down, things that challenges my beliefs. Why? Because I believe if you stay with the status quo, you're not living a proper life. You're not living a decentralized life. You need to question everything, and especially even the people around you. In fact, don't give anybody around you a pass. Always treat them like an M&M conference. And I think after listening to this podcast, you'll probably understand why I say that. And I think, you and I are both laughing because that's kind of how you and I have actually always had this relationship, and why I think you feel good about it, because you know that I'm not coming to rip your heart out. I'm doing this because I care.
Yes.
I think the second biggest thing is go back and study old books, old ideas, and see if they were put to bed for the right reason, or see if we missed something. See if we layered on another layer of evolutionary thinking that was centralized that wasn't decentralized. For example, we gave a good example here. Why were they so furious about hydroxychloroquine? Well, if they were smart enough, they would have known what me and Ted did. We would have went back and used methylene blue and nobody would have said anything about it because the idiots in the FDA and the CDC didn't know about it. You would never know that as a centralized or functional medicine guy because you didn't know the history behind those drugs. And the way you do that is you go back and look at older things, like the wisdom that the old doctors that taught me that were 80 years old when I was 25 and 30. If I could sit down with them now and have a discussion, the discussion would be radically different than what it would be then. And I think the third thing is you need to pick out 3 people in your life who you know are better thinkers than you, and you need to talk to them once a week for the rest of your life on every topic that you can imagine. I will tell you that if I had the 3 people available to me, the first person would be Da Vinci. The second person would be Feynman. The third person, I guess, would be Einstein. But I have to tell you, I think the 2 guys pounding at the door that I really like to let in is St. Georgie and probably Robert O. Becker. And Ilya Pirogeen's not a bad guy either.
Pirogeen, yeah. And your third piece of advice? This is very interesting.
Third piece of advice is make sure you surround yourself with a circle of 6 of people that truly understand you, and also people that you have to push, and they have to push you. In other words, you have I have a fatal flaw. My fatal flaw, I think, just got served to me 5 years ago, where I really didn't pay attention to a lot of other people around me for a variety of different reasons. Why? Because I never trusted anybody else to think like I think. But when you find somebody who you know thinks about things differently than you do, and they turn out to be right about those things, because the things that I've been the most wrong about in my life aren't things on science. They're actually things on life. They're things on relationships. They're things on, I would say they're things that probably most other people get more right than I've gotten right. And
connections.
Yes, absolutely. And I am unfortunately so focused and on being scientifically curious that I've gotten tunnel vision, and that tunnel vision has caused me to have a Dunning-Kruger effect, probably with a lot of the things that most other people get right. And but would I change this about me? No, because I think that I've lived an epic life. I've lived exactly the way that I want to live. I live on my own terms. I'm doing things that I never thought that I ever would be able to do. And I believe the reason that I do these things is because of who I am. And I make no apologies and no regrets for the things I've done. I'm not proud of everything I've done, but do I understand it? Yes. And do I think when they put me in the ground or I slide in at home plate when I'm done, I think I'll be happy.
You see, guys, this is why I love Jack, and Jack loves me. He always just exerts enough tough love, twirls me around and then sets me in a different direction with the way I think. But essentially, in the same general domain where both of us actually have common footing. Now, I would like to end this podcast with Jack. Actually, whatever he can announce to us of what's next for Jack, what's going, what's happening, what we're going to see in the future, as much as you can reveal at this point in time.
Well, we've been talking for 2.5 hours about something that Ted really wanted to pick my brain about. Jack, tell me what decentralized medicine is to you. Tell me why you think it's the next realm. I think anybody who listens to this podcast will have a pretty good flavor of that. So, Ted, what I would say to you, and this is really a personal message directly to you that I'm sure is going to resonate through you to your audience. My banned TED Talk that I gave in 2011 is the answer to this question. Ideation without execution leads to deletion of every good idea. I shared with you a lot of good ideas. Why? Because I think they're good. I don't care what anybody else thinks. So what do I have to do now? What's coming? I have to execute on those ideas. Otherwise, this podcast will never resonate with the 8 billion people on the planet that need to hear it.
Are we expecting any movie of your life soon, Jack?
Could be. Could be. There. Look, in quantum mechanics, what do they say? A lot of possibilities.
A lot of possibilities. Well,
they're endless.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jack. I just like to titillate our audience here that you will be hearing about Jack on a more global scale and a more global influence fairly soon. And you will be seeing him on a much grander visibility. I have a minuscule visibility, and Jack will have this outsized visibility where I am just
Ted, don't sell yourself short. I may need your help teaching a whole bunch of guys who think what's published in Peter Attia's book is correct. So keep your phone open.
Thank you so much, Jack, and thank you for talking to me through the sun and rain. Bye.
Take care.
What an incredible journey we've been on today. A huge thank you to Dr. Jack Kruse for gracing us with his insights, challenging our perspectives, and pushing the boundaries of what we thought we knew about healthcare and medicine. From decentralized medicine to quantum biology, we've covered a lot of ground today. Dr. Kruse's ideas are not just thought-provoking, they are revolutionary, and yes, sometimes controversial. But that's what makes conversations like this so essential. If you're intrigued as we are, be sure to check out Dr. Kruse's books, webinars, and social media platforms where he continues to educate, provoke, and inspire. Thank you for tuning into the Smarter Not Harder podcast. If today's episode has sparked your curiosity, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another mind-bending conversation. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop challenging the status quo. Goodbye.